Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are tearing into a stack of sources that detail a full-blown international crisis, and it's playing out right now in January 2026.
It is, and it all centers on the massive icy landscape of Greenland.
And this deep dive it's necessary because this is not just some diplomatic spat or a recycled headline from a few years ago.
No, not at all. Our sources indicate this standoff has escalated dramatically. I mean, it's threatening the entire security architecture of the North Atlantic.
It sounds like it's pushing the limits of international law resource competition.
And you could even argue the very existence of the NATO alliance itself.
So we're diving deep into the why.
Yeah.
Specifically, we need to understand the absolute urgency of the United States under the Trump administration in trying to acquire sovereignty or at least exclusive control over Greenland.
And just as important, we need to find the specific documents, the unshakable legal basis for Denmark's flat-out refusal to even, entertain the idea of a sale.
So our mission for you, the listener, is to move past the political spectacle to the fundamental mechanics of this conflict.
Exactly. We're exploring how Greenland stopped being just a piece of cold real estate and became, a convergence point for every critical geopolitical issue of our time.
We're talking missile defense strategy.
The global rare earth element supply chains.
And, maybe most profoundly, the fundamental right of a population to self-determination. All of it wrapped up in this unique constitutional framework.
The Rigsfællesskabet.
Right. The unity of the realm.
Our source material is pretty expansive. We've analyzed decades of treaty analyses, landmark court rulings, strategic military white papers.
And even recent White House memos and diplomatic cables.
And they all paint a picture that forces us to look at three collision points. First, the deep legal history that secured Denmark's title in the first place.
Then the modern constitutional barriers that, they locked that title away from being sold.
And finally, the immediate strategic imperatives that are driving the U.S. to push the envelope so aggressively right now in 2026.
The documents reveal an Arctic region that's undergoing rapid destabilization. I mean, we need to dissect exactly how an often overlooked stable territory.
A place most people just view as perpetually frozen.
Exactly. How did that suddenly become the central flashpoint that could actually break NATO?
Okay, let's unpack this. How did a stable Arctic territory suddenly become a global flashpoint?
We have to start with the legal title, because without understanding how Denmark owns it, you can't possibly understand why they can't legally sell it to anyone.
Right. And to dismiss this as some simple purchase offer, just ignore centuries of legal architecture that Copenhagen built.
And, more importantly, successfully defended in an international court.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The roots of Danish sovereignty are deep, very deep.
So it starts with the Norse legacy. We're talking about Eric the Red establishing settlements way back in the late 10th century.
And for centuries, these settlements formed a tenuous link tying the island's nominal claim to the Norwegian crown.
So then, when Norway and Denmark formed their unified kingdom, the Dano-Norwegian Union, in 1380.
That title was essentially merged under the Copenhagen administration. It all came under one roof.
But that Norse connection, it eventually collapsed, didn't it? I think in the 15th century due to climate change and just sheer isolation.
It did. But the legal connection, the claim on paper, it remained sort of theoretical until continuous colonization began again in the 18th century.
Okay, and that's specifically with the Dano-Norwegian missionary Hans Agad in 1721.
Yes. And Agad was originally sent to find the lost Norse settlers, but instead he established continuous Danish mission and trade stations on the west coast.
So that's the true inception of modern sovereignty.
That's the one. And this 18th century claim, it established the initial legal stance. The King of Denmark-Norway claimed absolutum dominium over the entire territory. Our sources specifically highlight the contemporary legal language that immediately incorporated the indigenous Inuit population. They defined them as our subjects.
And that was critical, right? Because it laid the groundwork for Denmark to claim sovereignty over the people and the land, not just a few trading posts.
Precisely. But even that early claim, it would have been insufficient on its own. The defining legal moment, the one that truly severed Greenland's fate from its historical sibling Norway, that happened in the fallout of the Napoleonic Wars.
The Treaty of Kiel in 1814.
That's it.
And context is everything here. The Kingdom of Denmark-Norway, they made a catastrophic error.
A huge one.
Backing the wrong horse, allying with Napoleonic France. So when Napoleon was defeated, Denmark-Norway was quickly defeated by the victorious coalition.
Led by Sweden and Great Britain, yeah. So King Frederick VI was forced to sign the Treaty of Kiel on January 14, 1814. He had to cede Norway to Sweden, a massive territorial loss.
But it contained a clause that has defined the legal status of the Arctic for 2 centuries.
And this is the massive, world-altering legal twist that U.S. diplomats are reportedly just struggling to overcome today.
It's Article 4 of the treaty.
Exactly. So while the Norwegian mainland was transferred lock, stock, and barrel to the King of Sweden, the treaty contained a crucial, specific exclusion clause.
Regarding the ancient Norwegian dependencies.
Right. It explicitly stated, La Groenland, l'Islande et les Faroe non comprises.
Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands were not included in the transfer.
So, by a specific legally binding document born out of military defeat, Greenland was severed from Norway and kept firmly under the Danish crown.
The sources suggest this was partly pragmatic. Denmark wanted to retain maritime assets.
And partly strategic. The British might have intervened to prevent Sweden from becoming too powerful in the North Atlantic.
But the legal effect was singular.
It created the foundational, definitive legal severance. It secured Greenland's status under Denmark and formed the historical basis for the Rigsfællesskabet, the unity of the realm that still persists today.
So the 1814 treaty provided the, let's call it the domestic and contractual claim.
But international law, which is what really matters in a territorial dispute, that didn't fully solidify it until a challenge was issued in the 20th century.
And that challenge, not surprisingly, came from Norway itself.
Of course. Once it regained independence, it started asserting its own claims in the early 1900s. The world was, trying to define the Arctic.
This was after Denmark sold the Danish West Indies, what we now call the U.S. Virgin Islands, to the U.S. in 1916.
A really important point. That sale included formal U.S. recognition of Danish sovereignty over all of Greenland. But Norway decided to capitalize on the fact that much of Greenland was still unsettled.
So what was Norway's specific legal argument?
They argued that Danish sovereignty only extended to the established, colonized, accessible settlements on the West Coast.
And the rest, the huge, unpopulated East Coast.
They claimed it was legally terra nullius.
No man's land.
Exactly, open to occupation by any state. And they actually followed through on this. They issued a proclamation in 1931 occupying a large part of eastern Greenland.
Which they called Eirik Raude's land.
Right.
That is the very definition of escalating a dispute. And that escalation led directly to the landmark case that fundamentally redefined Arctic international law.
The legal status of Eastern Greenland, Denmark v. Norway case, before the Permanent Court of International Justice, the PCIJ in The Hague in 1933.
And this 1933 decision is, well, it's absolutely foundational. Its robustness is why Denmark feels so legally secure today.
The court's decision was overwhelmingly in favor of Denmark, and it established 3 crucial legal doctrines that make Denmark's title exceptionally robust.
Let's break those down. What was the primary finding regarding the territory itself?
Okay, so first, the court decisively rejected Norway's terra nullius argument. They ruled that sovereignty doesn't require continuous physical occupation of every square mile of an area.
Especially in remote regions.
Especially, they found that Denmark had demonstrated the will and intention to act as sovereign over the entire island for centuries, even the uncolonized parts.
So wait, how did they demonstrate that? I mean, they didn't have troops everywhere.
No. The intention was shown through things like internal Danish legislation, taxation attempts, even if they failed to collect taxes, and diplomatic actions.
So they just needed to act like they were universally in charge, and the international community, through treaties and so on, just acknowledged that claim.
That's it. Secondly, the court upheld the supremacy of the 1814 Treaty of Kiel. They confirmed its role as the definitive instrument severing Norwegian claims forever.
And the third doctrine, this is the one that really stands out.
The most enduring and, I think, interesting legal concept established here, the polar sovereignty doctrine.
Right. This is the part that sounds counterintuitive to a casual listener. It establishes a kind of unique, lower standard for claiming polar territory.
Precisely. The PCIJ recognized that polar regions are unique. I mean, extreme inaccessibility, limited resources, tiny populations.
So the standard for establishing sovereignty has to be lower than in, say, Europe.
It has to be. They ruled that a continuous and peaceful display of state authority, that's the core legal concept, was sufficient even if that display was relatively intermittent.
But how did Denmark prove that continuous and peaceful display in a way that actually satisfied the court? What specific examples did the sources highlight?
Well, it wasn't through garrisons or forts. It was through paper and science.
Paper and science.
Yeah. The court accepted acts like Denmark issuing commercial treaties with other nations, treaties that excluded Greenland from being used by foreign vessels. It was acting as the gatekeeper.
Okay.
They pointed to specific Danish scientific and cartography expeditions that mapped and named parts of the East Coast. Even small acts, like granting permits for private Norwegian sealing vessels to hunt off the coast.
Which is something only a sovereign could grant.
Exactly. Those were deemed sufficient.
So in essence, the court acknowledged the reality of governing a gigantic ice-covered island. You don't build a courthouse on every fjord.
You demonstrate control through international paper trails and scientific presence.
That's the takeaway then.
It is. This case is exceptionally important because it remains the only case where the possession of a polar territory was decided by an international court.
Which means Denmark's claim isn't just domestic or contractual.
It is internationally affirmed, judicially bulletproofed, and it serves as a fundamental precedent for Arctic law itself. So if you want to know why Denmark is so confident in repeatedly saying no to the U.S. today, the 1933 PCIJ ruling is the core legal fact.
Okay, so Part I confirms that Denmark holds the title and it's legally robust. Now we move to Part 2. Why Denmark, even if they wanted the money, literally cannot transfer that title.
Right. This is where the post-World War II concept of self-determination collides with all that inherited legal architecture.
While the U.S. acknowledged Danish sovereignty in 1916 and the PCIJ affirmed it in 1933, the actual status of Greenland shifted fundamentally after the war.
It did, spurred by the UN's decolonization movement and a growing national identity in Nuuk, in Greenland's capital.
The U.S. had already established a significant military footprint at Thulin-Alpatufik during and after the war. The formal colonial status just became untenable.
It was untenable, both internationally and domestically in Denmark, so they opted for integration over outright independence or trusteeship.
And that decision led to the 1953 constitutional integration. Greenland's colonial status was formally abolished.
And it became an equal county, an amt, within the Danish realm. This move granted Greenlanders Danish citizenship and representation in the Danish parliament, the Folketing.
Which sounds like a very progressive move, but it had a massive unintended paradox.
It really did. The move was intended to integrate Greenlanders into the Danish welfare state, but by giving them equal status, it ironically highlighted the vast cultural, linguistic, and geographic differences
between Copenhagen and Nuuk.
Exactly. It fueled a political counter-movement towards self-rule, which culminated in the Home Rule Act of 1979, and then the definitive constitutional lock we see today.
The 2009 Act on Greenland Self-Government.
That's the one.
And here's where it gets really interesting for the modern discussion, because the 2009 Act fundamentally reorganized the Rigsfællesskabet.
And it moved the ultimate lever of sovereignty from the Danish parliament to the Greenlandic people themselves.
This act is the absolute constitutional barrier against a U.S. sale.
It achieved two major sovereignty shifts. First, the act formally recognized Greenlanders as a people under international law.
Which means they possess the inherent right to self-determination as outlined in the UN Charter.
A critical legal elevation. They went from being a mere administrative population to a people with the recognized right to decide their own political destiny.
And the second shift is arguably the most crucial point driving the current resource war. The thing that makes the territory valuable enough for the U.S. to threaten NATO over.
The transfer of resource ownership.
Exactly.
Absolutely vital. The act explicitly transferred the ownership and management rights of mineral and subsurface resources, the rare earth elements, the hydro potential, the oil and gas, entirely from Denmark to Greenland.
So that established the financial engine necessary for eventual independence.
And this isn't just symbolic ownership either. This transfer is tied to a specific financial mechanism that underpins the entire independence project.
Right. The block grant.
That is the genius and the complexity of the Self-Government Act. Greenland receives a massive annual block grant subsidy from Denmark. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. It keeps their economy afloat.
But the act stipulates that as revenues from resource extraction accrue to Greenland,
be it from mining rare earths or fishing, that Danish block grant is reduced proportionally.
So Greenland gains financial independence not by replacing the Danish subsidy with U.S. cash in a purchase.
No. They replace the Danish subsidy with their own resource revenue, inching toward the financial viability required for statehood.
So the people of Greenland literally own the strategic rare earth deposits that the U.S. is so desperate to acquire.
And any transaction must start and end with them.
This structure leads us directly to what's being called the Greenlandic veto, the secession mechanism in Chapter 8 of the 2009 Act. It's the ultimate constitutional lock key.
It is. This mechanism explicitly outlines the only legal route for changing Greenland's status, whether that's independence or, hypothetically, a transfer of sovereignty to a third party.
And that's all in Section 21 of the Self-Government Act.
It states unequivocally that the decision regarding Greenland's independence shall be taken by the people of Greenland.
So you can think of the 2009 Act as Denmark legally putting Greenland's sovereignty into a safe deposit box with a double lock.
That's a great analogy.
Copenhagen holds one key, but the Greenlandic people hold the only key to the referendum lock. So no matter how much money is offered, Denmark can't physically open the box and hand over the contents.
That analogy holds up perfectly. And what's more, the Act mandates a specific, multi-layered approval process before any final agreement can be made. Walk us through the actual approvals needed.
Okay, so the final agreement, if it ever got that far, requires 3 distinct mandatory approvals. First, the Greenlandic Parliament, the Inatsisartut, must approve the terms. Second, the Danish Parliament, the Folketing, must also approve the terms, to uphold the integrity of the realm.
And the third approval?
The constitutional deal breaker for the U.S. purchase idea. It must be endorsed by a mandatory binding referendum held among the people of Greenland.
Which means the sovereignty cannot be transacted by 2 governments, Copenhagen and Washington, over the heads of the 56,000 people who live there.
So when U.S. officials approach Copenhagen with a multi-billion-dollar offer and Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen says no.
She's not being culturally stubborn or politically evasive.
She's being legally accurate. They cannot transact the territory. Sovereignty is constitutionally locked behind that mandatory Greenlandic referendum.
The U.S. must deal with Nuuk, the Greenlandic government, first and foremost, not just Copenhagen.
That's the crucial modern insight. The 2009 Act completely reframed the relationship. It moved from Denmark possessing Greenland to Denmark acting as the custodian of the realm.
Until Greenland chooses, on its own terms and its own financial footing, to determine its future. That right resides solely in the hands of the Greenlandic people.
Which makes any unilateral acquisition an act of conquest, not commerce. The law says no. The Constitution says no. So let's turn now to why the Pentagon and the Trump administration believe that no is absolutely unacceptable.
Right. We have to shift focus to the U.S. strategic perspective, the real estate approach to national security.
For the U.S., acquiring Greenland is now seen as an absolute necessity.
And that necessity is overwhelmingly geographic and military. Greenland is strategically positioned as, well, you could argue it's the single most important piece of undeveloped real estate for North American defense.
Its location directly on the Great Circle Route makes it irreplaceable.
To put that into perspective for our listener, the Great Circle Route is the shortest possible path for intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, launched from Russia or China towards North America.
And it arches directly over the Arctic region.
And that path takes us straight to Pituffik Space Base, formerly known as Thule Air Base.
Located a staggering 750 miles north of the Arctic Circle. This is the U.S. Space Force's northernmost installation.
And in the current strategic climate, it is simply indispensable.
What specific systems at Pituffik make it so vital right now?
It houses the ANFPS-132 upgraded early warning radar. This is a massive solid-state phased array system. It's a technological giant operated by the 12th Space Warning Squadron.
And its purpose is twofold.
Both are non-negotiable for continental defense. First, missile warning. It is the primary system for detecting ICBMs immediately upon launch from the Eurasian landmass.
Because of its extreme northern location, it provides the earliest possible warning.
Giving decision-makers in NORAD and the Pentagon the maximum time minutes, but crucial minutes, to assess the threat and respond.
And the second purpose?
Space domain awareness. Tracking debris, satellites, and monitoring all objects in polar orbits. It is the eye in the far north.
But the U.S. concern has only increased dramatically with the advent of next-generation weaponry.
Hypersonic technology.
Right. This is where the existing radar faces new limitations.
This is absolutely critical to the current urgency. Adversaries like Russia and China are developing and deploying hypersonic glide vehicles, or HGVs.
These are not traditional ballistic missiles. They fly much lower.
Much lower, below the traditional space envelope, and much faster. And they can maneuver mid-flight. The geometry of detection for these vehicles is infinitely harder.
So if they fly lower, you need a sensor that can look further over the curve of the Earth.
Exactly. You need sensors positioned as far north as humanly possible, ideally directly on the arc of attack. This allows the U.S. to detect these low, fast threats.
And, crucially, it provides the missile defense interceptors with a viable engagement window if detection comes too late.
The threat cannot be neutralized.
And this feeds directly into President Trump's vision of a layered defense system.
The so-called Golden Dome missile defense system, which absolutely requires Greenlandic geography.
The strategic logic is simple then. Control over Greenland equals control over the missile pathways.
If the U.S. controlled the island entirely, they could station advanced mobile sensor arrays and missile interceptors across the territory,
allowing them to neutralize HGV and ICBM threats far sooner.
Theoretically, before they even enter Canadian or American airspace. Control over this top-of-the-world vantage point is seen as integral to maintaining superiority.
And beyond missile defense, Greenland also anchors the western side of another critical choke point, the GIUK gap.
Greenland, Iceland, UK. And that historical naval term suddenly matters in 2026 for one big reason.
Ice is melting.
Exactly. Historically, the Arctic ice cap was a permanent, impenetrable barrier to naval navigation, funneling all traffic through the GIUK gap.
But now, as the ice cap recedes, the Arctic is transforming from an ice barrier into a series of potentially navigable ocean lanes.
And that fundamentally changes the nature of the choke point. The U.S. strategic concern is that if Greenland is not under its exclusive trusted control,
deep-water fjords along its coast could be utilized by Chinese or Russian-attacked submarines and surface vessels,
giving them a critical military logistics foothold right next to North America's littoral zone.
This connects directly to the rhetoric we saw in 2025 about Greenland potentially being covered with Russian and Chinese ships.
It frames the acquisition as a necessary denial strategy. China, you have to remember, self-identifies as a near-Arctic state and is actively pushing its Polar Silk Road initiative.
The U.S. wants to slam that door shut before it opens any wider.
That is the defensive military necessity. But there is a second major driver that is purely economic and technological. The global resource war.
Rare earth elements, or REs, the things that power modern technology that the world barely talks about until there's a shortage.
Precisely. We are talking about 17 elements essential to everything from F-35 fighter jets and advanced guidance systems to the high-powered magnets in electric vehicle batteries.
In every single smartphone.
Right. And the issue is China's historic, terrifying dominance in the sector.
Give us the hard numbers on that dominance.
Well, as of the mid-2010s, China controlled roughly 95% of global RE production and processing capacity. More importantly, they maintain an even tighter grip on the heavy rare earths HREs.
Like dysprosium and terbium?
Which are especially vital for defense hardware and high-efficiency magnets. Securing non-Chinese, Western-controlled sources is no longer just an economic goal.
It's a national security imperative.
Yeah.
Tied to economic decoupling and military preparedness.
And Greenland has the potential answer. Specifically through two major, highly controversial mining projects in the south of the island.
Kavana Field and Tanbreeze.
Kavana Field, known locally as Quanersuit, is immense. It's described as one of the world's largest multi-element deposits.
And it contains critical light rare earths, like neodymium.
Vital for powerful permanent magnets in defense applications, and dysprosium. But here's the complication.
The byproduct.
It also contains significant quantities of uranium as a byproduct, and that uranium component is the flashpoint.
It's the political and regulatory anchor that stalled the project for years.
Kavana Field's strategic significance is its potential to shatter Chinese REE dominance, but the environmental and political sensitivities around uranium mining have made it toxic domestically in Greenland.
Then you have the alternative, Tanbreeze at Greenland.
Tanbreeze is another massive resource, rich in heavy rare earths. But it has the distinct strategic advantage of having a significantly lower uranium content.
Politically, this has given it an easier path to develop.
This is still challenging, but easier path, yes.
And this whole resource issue is inherently entangled with the incredibly volatile nature of Greenlandic domestic politics. That's why the situation became so urgent for the U.S. in 2025.
We have to step back to 2021. The environmentalist Inuit Ataqatigiit Party won a general election largely on an anti-uranium mining platform.
And they quickly passed an act banning the mining of any ore with uranium content exceeding 100 parts per million.
That ban, designed to protect the fragile environment, effectively stalled the Finnick field, despite years of investment.
But the political winds shifted dramatically in the March 2025 general election.
They did. The pro-mining Liberal Democrats, the Democratic, won the election, and their leader, Jens Fredrik Nielsen, became prime minister.
And Prime Minister Nielsen represents a pragmatic path toward rapid financial independence.
He explicitly stated he is open to Western investment from the U.S. or the EU to finance statehood. He firmly opposes annexation, but welcomes partnership.
And the most crucial single vote in the history of the project happened late in 2025.
That's right. His parliament narrowly voted by a margin of 15 to 14 to overturn that 4-year-old uranium mining ban.
Imagine the tension in that chamber. A single vote determining global rare earth supply.
And that one vote reignited development interest. And more critically, it immediately escalated the U.S. urgency. Suddenly, a source of critical minerals that had been politically blocked was available again.
And Washington wants to secure it before any Chinese entities can re-engage.
And finally, there's the legal quagmire that the U.S. sources specifically cite as a reason for seeking outright control.
The Australian owner of the Kvaneth Field license, Energy Transition Minerals.
ETM. They are currently suing the Danish and Greenlandic governments for up to $11.5 billion over the expropriation of their license due to the former uranium ban.
That is a massive sum. It dwarfs Greenland's entire annual budget.
It is. And the U.S. perspective, as articulated in leaked policy discussions, is that direct control of Greenland would allow federal preemption to bypass these petty regulatory hurdles and costly international lawsuits.
So acquisition, they believe, would allow them to force rapid mine development for the U.S. defense industrial base,
while ignoring the decade-long regulatory battles.
So the crisis we see unfolding in January 2026, the shift from diplomatic maneuvering to explicit, alarming threats against a NATO ally, is the result of a single event.
A single kinetic event that happened far from the Arctic.
The catalyst, the Venezuela operation. In the first week of January 2026, U.S. military forces conducted a highly publicized operation in Caracas,
aimed at capturing President Nicolas Maduro. This was a pivotal moment for European diplomacy. It demonstrated an unambiguous willingness by the Trump administration to use military force.
And to explicitly violate national sovereignty to achieve what it deemed national security priorities.
It established a dangerous precedent that immediately destabilized Europe's perception of U.S. intent toward Greenland.
That's the core question. How did capturing Maduro immediately translate into fear over Greenland?
Because the operation proved that the administration was willing to disregard international law. If the U.S. is willing to capture the head of state of an oil-rich nation thousands of miles away,
European capitals immediately asked, what would they do for Greenland, which sits directly on the axis of North American defense?
The transactional territorial real estate doctrine suddenly became very real.
And the link was made explicit immediately after the Venezuela operation.
It was. White House statements indicated that utilizing the U.S. military is always an option to secure strategic assets like Greenland. The rhetoric was dramatic and immediate.
President Trump was quoted stating, "We need Greenland, absolutely. We need it for defense. Denmark is not going to be able to do it."
And they have the wrong people in charge right now. This suggested not just annoyance, but an active belief that Danish custodianship was a security liability.
And most alarming to Copenhagen was the cryptic 20-day timeline he gave reporters,
stating, "Let's talk about Greenland in 20 days. This was interpreted in Copenhagen and Nuuk not as a joke, but as a potential ultimatum.
Or a timeline for coordinated covert action. It triggered fears of an impending crisis.
Meanwhile, senior staff actively sought to undermine the very legitimacy of Danish control. Stephen Miller was quoted questioning the historical basis of Denmark's claim,
asking, what is their actual basis of having Greenland as a colony? The people there deserve self-determination.
And then he made the chilling assertion that provides the administration's cynical calculation. Nobody is going to fight the U.S. militarily over the future of Greenland.
That last point is crucial, isn't it? That calculation that even if Denmark is a NATO ally, no one will risk a conflict with the U.S. over a remote island.
It's the central diplomatic challenge. It assumes NATO solidarity is conditional. And then the administration amplified the fear via social media.
Right, Katie Miller's viral post.
A picture of Greenland covered in an American flag, captioned simply "soon." It was widely interpreted by European diplomats as a signal of serious near-term intent.
Moving the issue from diplomatic absurdity to immediate threat assessment.
So while military action was threatened and Venezuela made that threat credible, our sources indicate a leaked non-forceful mechanism was the preferred path.
The Compact of Free Association proposal, or COFA.
This is the proposed middle path of acquisition, a method designed to gain maximum control while minimizing administrative liability.
And, crucially, attempting to bypass the constitutional lock without triggering an international war.
The COFA model is based on existing agreements the U.S. has with Pacific Island nations, Micronesia, Palau, the Marshall Islands.
So why is this COFA model more attractive than, say, a traditional 99-year military lease or outright statehood?
It's attractive because it's a form of sovereignty transfer without integration. A lease is temporary, offers limited control.
And statehood requires granting full U.S. citizenship, extending all federal benefits, and fully integrating a population with a unique culture and language.
A costly, messy process the U.S. wants to avoid.
So, walk us through the terms of a hypothetical COFA arrangement for Greenland. What would the strategic trade-off be?
Greenland would be granted significant long-term financial assistance, billions in infrastructure aid, budget support, development grants.
And potentially highly desirable benefits for its residents, like visa-free travel to the U.S. for work and education.
And in exchange,
the U.S. would gain full, exclusive military access to the entire territory and, most importantly, authority over Greenland's foreign policy and full defense responsibilities would be transferred from Denmark to the United States.
That is the key strategic goal. The U.S. secures Patuxent, shuts the GI-UK gap to adversaries, and controls the strategic minerals, all without the cost of integrating the population.
Essentially transforming Greenland into a powerful, financially dependent client state, stripping Copenhagen of its remaining sovereignty over the island.
All while claiming it was done by peaceful means. Its acquisition via strategic economic and defense arrangement. It's designed to achieve U.S. strategic control while attempting to present the change to the Greenlandic people as a path to financial self-sufficiency.
And independence from Denmark, just under a new, much larger protectorate.
This brings us to the highest stakes element of the crisis, which our sources confirm is now the immediate focus of European diplomacy.
The direct existential threat to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The aggressive posture of the U.S. in January 2026 has forced Denmark, a loyal NATO member, to draw a definitive red line.
Regarding Article 5.
And Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen's rhetoric has escalated in perfect sync with the U.S. threats.
She moved from dismissing the idea of a sale as absurd in 2019 to issuing a grave and specific warning in 2026.
A U.S. violation of Greenlandic sovereignty would trigger the collapse of Article 5 and the NATO alliance.
This is the Article 5 paradox defined in catastrophic terms.
It really is. Article 5 is the heart of the NATO treaty. An attack against one member is considered an attack against all.
So if the U.S., the military backbone of NATO, uses force against Greenland, which is unequivocally part of the Danish realm, a founding NATO member, the treaty requires other NATO members to come to Denmark's aid.
So Germany, France, the UK, they would be legally obligated to assist Denmark against the United States. That's an impossible operational reality.
It is politically and militarily impossible, which is why Frederiksen made her statement so explicit. She confirmed that such an event would functionally dissolve the alliance on the spot.
She said, if the United States chooses to attack another NATO country militarily, then everything stops.
This is Europe confirming that they view the crisis not as a territorial squabble, but as an existential threat to the post-World War II security order.
And the sources indicate that unlike previous years, where European leaders might have quietly rolled their eyes at the U.S. rhetoric,
the Venezuela precedent created immediate unified solidarity on the issue. The response was immediate and remarkably forceful.
Leaders from major European powers, France, Germany, the UK, Italy, Poland, and Spain, issued a joint statement.
It was distributed almost immediately after the White House's 20-day timeline statement, and the language used was succinct and carried maximum weight.
It stated, Greenland belongs to his people. It is for Denmark and Greenland, and them only, to decide on matters concerning Denmark and Greenland.
And note the specific inclusion of Greenland. They are recognizing the constitutional lock.
This united front is incredibly significant. It means Europe is not just siding with Denmark, they are defending the rules-based international order itself.
Exactly. They are signaling that they view the Greenland issue not as a minor bilateral dispute, but as a fundamental violation of the UN Charter principles of territorial integrity.
Much in the same way they view Russian aggression against neighboring states.
It elevates Arctic security from a regional issue to a global test of Western values.
This intense diplomatic pressure leads us back to the crucial Greenlandic position, articulated by the newly elected Prime Minister, Jens Frederik Nielsen.
And he is walking a near impossible tightrope.
Nielsen, a former professional badminton champion who moved into politics.
He's described as fiercely pragmatic and focused entirely on the long-term goal of independence. He called the annexation fantasies from Washington disrespectful and a childish misunderstanding of sovereignty.
But his government still needs massive investment to achieve that financial independence from Denmark. That's what the U.S. is trying to exploit.
And he's handling that tension with a strategic alternative, partnership over domination. He is actively internationalizing Greenland's economy to prevent it from becoming solely reliant on Washington's leverage.
And he's primarily courting the European Union to counterbalance the U.S. pressure.
He has been relentless. He invited the EU to invest heavily in mining infrastructure, rare earth processing, and large-scale hydropower projects.
His message to the European Parliament was highly strategic.
It was, he said. Greenland needs the European Union, and the European Union needs Greenland for its energy transition and strategic supply chains.
So this approach aims to leverage resource wealth to achieve financial independence from Denmark, the long-term constitutional goal, but without succumbing to the control of a predatory power.
So in a strange geopolitical twist, the pressure from Washington is inadvertently speeding up Greenland's move toward global relevance?
Forcing them to find international partners to ensure their path to independence remains sovereign, not subservient.
We've covered centuries of history, specific international legal rulings, deep military strategy, and immediate geopolitical flashpoints today.
Well, let's quickly recap the three fundamental collision points that define the January 2026 Greenland crisis.
Okay, first, the historical legality. Denmark's sovereignty is historically and judicially indisputable, cemented by the 1814 Treaty of Kiel and that robust 1933 PCIJ ruling.
The one that bulletproofed Arctic sovereignty standards with the Polar Sovereignty Doctrine.
Exactly. Second, the constitutional reality. Denmark cannot sell Greenland. The 2009 Self-Government Act placed the future of sovereignty and the ownership of all critical rare earth minerals into the hands of the Greenlandic people,
constitutionally locking any transfer behind a mandatory national referendum.
And third, the strategic imperative. The U.S. push, driven by the absolute necessity of advanced missile defense.
Pitufik, the Golden Dome, the HGV threat.
And the global economic race for rare earth elements, chemifield, and tanbreeze accelerated dramatically after Venezuela,
putting NATO itself under existential threat via the Article 5 paradox.
The resolution of this standoff is going to define a lot more than just the Arctic. It will define the future of the rules-based international order, determine control of global technology supply chains,
and test whether the NATO alliance can survive a challenge from within its own ranks.
The central tension here is between sovereignty and strategic necessity. For Denmark and Greenland, this is about law, self-determination, and constitutional integrity.
For the U.S. administration, this is framed as a matter of immediate strategic survival and defense.
And this brings us to a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over as we close.
The U.S. interest is tied to securing strategic resources that were previously blocked by Greenlandic local politics.
Yeah.
That 2021 uranium mining ban.
But the political shift in 2025 has repealed that ban, opening the door for massive resource development under Prime Minister Nielsen.
So, if Nielsen and his government successfully use international investment from the EU or elsewhere to rapidly develop these mines, increase revenue exponentially, and replace the Danish block grant subsidy,
will Greenland's ability to leverage its mineral wealth make secession and the inevitable end of the Rigsfællesskabet inevitable, regardless of whether the U.S. successfully acquires it or not?
Financial independence is the constitutional gateway to political independence.
The U.S. might be threatening to buy Greenland today, but its real fate may simply be to fund its own departure.
A question for a future deep dive. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.